There's nothing more common than to realize that your heroes are not just mortal, but they are imperfect mortals at that. When I was a young guy, when I was a kid, when I was 16, 17 years old, I thought that James Joyce was the greatest artist ever. And I won't lie, I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be a kind of writer, like the Telegraph once said, a writer who published nothing but masterpieces. I wanted to be that very badly. I thought that, you know, having a career like James Joyce would be what I should aspire to. Okay? He was my hero, my literary hero. I read everything that Joyce wrote. I read the 4 major published books: Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. I read them repeatedly. I memorized huge passages of them, like Finnegan's Wake. A river run from swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by, commodious vicus of recirculation to Howth Castle and environs. That's the first sentence of that novel. Novel, I say now with a smirk, because it's not really a novel, it's just shit being flung on a page. When I was a boy, when I was a young man, I thought that he was untouchable, James Joyce. And now I just look at him and I find him so paltry, so pathetic, as an artist and as a man. Because see, that's the thing about growing older. You start to realize things. You start to realize that what you had thought was heroic and amazing, you realize retrospectively is trivial and common and even disreputable, even immoral. I thought that James Joyce was so as a 49-year-old man, I want to go back to my 16-year-old self and slap him upside the head for thinking that Joyce was such a great thing. But by the same token, by the fact that I'm 49, I can be charitable and understand why a boy, a young man who didn't know any better, would think that somebody like James Joyce was a model to emulate. Let me tell you about James Joyce. See, James Joyce was born in 1882, I believe, and he was the son of a mid-level functionary. He was middle class, upper middle class, but his whole family was decaying, was on the downward slope of social mobility. And Joyce was a brilliant student, and I think that that's what attracted me to him when I was young. He was brilliant in every way. He was an accomplished singer, very musical, a tenor, I believe. He was an exceptionally gifted student. He did very well. He had it all. He had all the talent in the world. He was charming. He was witty. He was attractive. But he mishandled all of these gifts. He, in a very real sense, frittered them away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What happened was that, see, around, he wanted to study medicine, and he went to Paris when he was 20. And he only lasted like 3-4 months. And that is a sign of the kind of man that he would be, of the kind of man that he was. See, he got to Paris, and of course he was unhappy, because everybody's unhappy when they leave home. Everybody's homesick, everybody, feels despondent and depressed and nervous and frightened. But what happened with him was that he ran back home. He ran back home and basically suspended his studies and just became a little party animal, Around 1900, 1902, just a little party animal going from party to party and drinking. Drinking would always be the constant in James Joyce's life. I have no respect for drinkers, When I was young, I thought that drinking was, it was very funny and cool. All the great writers are, semi-alcoholics now. I don't find it charming at all, because I've seen what alcoholism can do. Not from direct experience. I'm not a drinker at all, actually. But from people I know, and well, Again, I still keep getting ahead of myself. So in 1904, he met a chambermaid, a woman named Nora Barnacle, on June 14th, 1904. Now this date is important. It'll be pivotal later. Now this day has become known as Bloomsday because of James Joyce. He met her, and a few months later they ran away together to Paris, I believe. But eventually he wound up in Trieste in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where James Joyce taught English at the Berlitz School, or by way of the Berlitz, found contacts with students and what have you. And he was an English teacher. He did like a whole bunch of money-making schemes during his 20s and his 30s. All of them unsuccessful, all of them failures. You know, what he really was just an English teacher. During that time, he tried to set up a cinema. He tried to import plaid, I think, plaid or tweed from Ireland to Trieste. It doesn't matter. All these ventures failed. And the only thing that was keeping him, you know, with a roof over his head was teaching English. And he was writing. He was writing all the time. Now, his writing career had started really in secondary school. And as I said, he'd been a brilliant student, considered a brilliant student. But he never really finished anything. He wrote an enormous novel called Stephen Hero around 1904, when he was, what, 22? And it was an enormous autobiographical novel, you know, a 1,000-page sucker, you know, one of those monster books that will never be published. You know, it's too big and too boring, you know, because an autobiographical novel, you know, for the most part, it's very interesting to the person who writes it, but very boring to everybody else. Because, you know, very few people have an interesting autobiography, you know. Most people are kind of boring, and writers especially are boring, you know. But anyway, he wrote Stephen Hero and got nowhere, and he tried to get published and nothing really happened. And he wrote and wrote, and he drank and he drank, and he was in Trieste, you know, and his family was growing. He had a son with Nora Barnacle named Giorgio, and then a daughter named Lucia. And James Joyce never returned to Ireland after, what, 1910? The closest he ever got was London at some point, but, you know, sporadic trips kind of thing. Anyway, he's living in Trieste, and he's writing. And by, you know, a happy coincidence, he gets to know Ezra Pound, who was the editor of The Egotist. The Egotist was basically a literary magazine funded by a rich woman. Now, here's something important about James Joyce. James Joyce, as I said before, his family had been well-to-do, but they had been on the downward slope. And he was perennially short on money. And one of the talents that he honed over the years was an ability to get loans from his friends and acquaintances, loans that would never be repaid. You know, basically he was a moocher, and he would use the money that he would get to fund his drinking and his clothes. He was a profligate spender, but unwise in his spending. And you know, I keep saying all these negative things about James Joyce, and I'm still not talking about his work. So let me get to it. He worked on Stephen Hero, and that got nowhere. Nobody wanted to publish it. And so he started rewriting it as a much shorter novel, a much more economical book. And that book eventually became A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It was a combination of Stephen Hero and some ideas that he had written up in an essay called A Portrait of the Artist. Now, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the novel, was 5 chapters, and it was exquisitely modernist. Following Flaubert, it was a free, indirect style, very self-consciously modern, and I remember reading it as a 16-year-old, and I was so impressed with the delicacy of the work, of the writing, the craftsmanship of it. It's an exceptionally well-written novel, right? And the way it is written stylistically, it still feels vibrant 100 years after it was published, because it eventually would be published. Because around the years 1914, 1915, things started to turn around insofar as Joyce's literary career. Hooking up with Ezra Pound was one of the best things that ever happened to him. And by hooking up with Ezra Pound, he gained the attention of Harriet Weaver, I believe her name, Harriet Shaw Weaver. That was her name. She would become his patron. She was a rich heiress, childless, single, older than Joyce, and he essentially did to her what he had done to all his friends. He mooched off of her for many, many years. It was because of her patronage that he was able to write Ulysses, all right? The second great novel that he wrote. Now, as I said, he wrote the short stories Dubliners, and those were published in 1914, and many people admired the stories, and they're very well written, very well crafted. One of the stories that was never written was called Ulysses, and it was what became the novel Ulysses. Now, what happened with Dubliners is because of Dubliners that the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man got published first in serial form by The Egotist, and then because of his growing reputation, it was published as a novel first in New York and then in London. And by 1915, Joyce's literary career is taking off. He's got a short story collection. He's got this Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He's, at that time, he is 33 years old, right? And so he embarks on Ulysses, all the while living with his family in Trieste, and then I think he moved to Paris at some point. I forget when he moved to Paris, but eventually he would. And during this time, during the years 1915 to 1922, he writes Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is a very important book that we have to dwell on a little bit. I used to think that it was just, the greatest thing ever. And now I look at it as trivial. And let me explain why. See, excuse me. Ulysses is a novel about a man named Leopold Bloom who goes through a day in Dublin. And the day, of course, is June 14th, 1904. Now, during this day, he comes across a young man named Stephen Dedalus. Stephen Dedalus is the protagonist of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And where the portrait is Stephen from the time he was a boy up until the time he leaves Ireland at the age of 22, as Joyce did. Ulysses takes place during a sojourn that Stephen takes back from Paris to Dublin because his mother is dying. During this day, November 15th, 4th, 1904, whatever the day, it doesn't matter. Stephen and Leopold Bloom keep crossing each other throughout the day, throughout the city, throughout the novel. See? They run into each other at different points, and their paths are parallel. Because you see, the novel is basically a retelling of the Odyssey, Homer's The Odyssey, transplanted to 1904's Dublin. Leopold Bloom is Odysseus. Stephen Dedalus is Telemachus, his son. Right? And Penelope is, of course, Molly Bloom, Leopold Bloom's cheating wife, quite frankly. She's cheating, she's an actress, and she's cheating on him with her agent. And anyway, these three main characters, do different things during the day, and each chapter in the novel, there are 18 chapters, each one of them corresponds to a different section of the Odyssey. It parallels that different section of the Odyssey. And at the same time, each chapter is internally consistent insofar as different metaphors and different allusions. Because the novel is filled with allusions, and each chapter is written in a different style. Parodying some styles, copying some styles, It's this polyphonic novel. For instance, some chapters discuss, all the metaphors revolve around certain colors, certain body parts, certain astrological signs, whereas a different chapter will have a different color, a different body part, different astrological signs, different numbers. It's all very complex, like clockwork, like a supremely complex verbal clockwork. All right? And when you're young, when I was young, and I know most of the people who read it felt the same, at that age, what I was impressed was by the cleverness of it, how clever it was. And I confused cleverness with brilliance. I thought to myself, man, I wish I could write something like this. So clever and thought out and careful, and oh, this little metaphor here and this metaphor there. It's so neat and tidy and orderly. I was obsessed with the writer and the book. I read Richard Ellman's biography. I remember reading stuff written by Anthony Burgess. That's how I discovered Burgess and got around to reading Clockwork Orange, as a matter of fact, was because of his commentary and writing on Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. Anyway, about Ulysses, it seems so brilliant, but I was confusing profundity with cleverness. It wasn't brilliant, or you could say it was brilliant, but in a facile way, in a superficial way. See? There's very little that is human in Ulysses. It's all very clever. It's all surface. And it's not a great book. It seems so. It seems so to somebody who's young, to somebody who's callow. And all young people, by definition, are callow. But as I've grown older, every year, I look at that novel, and I look at Finnegan's Wake, which I'll discuss presently, and I realize that all this intelligence, all this knowledge, was placed in the service of creating a pretty bauble. But it's like a diamond. A diamond is cold and hard, and it doesn't give any warmth to a human being. And the funny thing is that the novel, Ulysses, is so blind to human beings. Carl Jung wrote about Ulysses. He wrote about it extensively. He actually knew James Joyce, or got to know him later on. And he wrote about it, and he talked about how Ulysses was sort of like a conscious mind diving into the unconscious. It's a novel that intellectuals get excited over. Carl Jung was a great intellectual, but he was humane. Fyodor Dostoevsky was not an intellectual, but he was humane. He was a psychologist. But my point about James Joyce and Ulysses, you see, it is so brilliant in a clever way, but so lacking in humanity. And as you get older, you start to feel that what you really want is not cleverness. Cleverness, there's plenty of cleverness to go around. What you want is human warmth. You want to feel that a writer understands you. See, as I've grown older, I've admired Fyodor Dostoevsky's novels more and more because they're so human. They understand human beings and human frailties. When I was young, I read Crime and Punishment, and Raskolnikov killing the woman, the money changer, and her sister. And I thought, very interesting, but it didn't strike me on a moral level what Raskolnikov had done. And as I got older and I started to realize what he had done, and realizing the horror of murder, and I started to understand how profound Dostoevsky's novel really was, especially in the final moments of Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov finds a moment of grace when he truly and completely embraces his guilt. And how, when he embraces his guilt, he understands truly what he has done and asks for forgiveness. He asks God for forgiveness. And it doesn't matter if you believe in God or not. You understand in a human way the issues of guilt, of how guilt eats at the soul. And all of us have committed things that we're ashamed of, deeply ashamed of, right? Every single human being has done such a thing. And when you read Crime and Punishment, you feel that Dostoevsky, as a man, understands you. And in an odd way, by writing that novel, he has forgiven you. He has basically said, I know, I understand, because I too feel as you do. But with James Joyce, all you have is brilliance, you know. Brilliance, but facile brilliance that doesn't touch on the human experience. And this was compounded in Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is a novel that took him 17 years to write. And it's written in this dream language. For instance, what has gone, how it ends, begin to forget it. It will remember itself from all sides, in all languages, in each our word. Today is truth, tomorrow is trend. I mixed it up there, doesn't matter. Shit, I hadn't thought of that in years. But anyway, you see, it sounds beautiful. And you unpack Finnegan's Wake and you start to realize that each word is a pun or an allusion to several things happening simultaneously. For instance, river run from swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by commodious vicus of recirculation to Howth Castle and environs. Like, commodious vicus of recirculation is referencing the philosopher Vico and his circular theory of history. And Howth Castle and environs, HCE is the name of the main character, and those three initials, HCE, will reappear throughout the novel. The novel is a dream, right? And the last sentence is cut off in midstream, and you know it catches up on the first sentence, right? So it's a circular novel, you know, mimicking Vico, and in four parts, in 4 chapters, which is basically the Vico's 4-quadrant theory. But anyway, it's all very brilliant with all these allusions, multiple languages, using Italian, French, Latin, German, every single language you can possibly think of in this salad of words. And you look at it and you try to get the meaning out of it. And every single page is filled with meaning and ideas and concepts. But they don't add up to anything. It's like an encyclopedia where somebody took all the articles and scratched out the names of every single article and just mixed and matched and scrambled them all up, and all of a sudden you have this encyclopedia, and you flip around at random, and sometimes you're talking about medical issues, and sometimes political issues, and sometimes historical issues, and sometimes, you know, how paint dries. You know, it's all over the place. It's encyclopedic in a pointless way. It's autistic, really, if you think about it. You know? It's not human. You know? There's no human sensibility. There's no human feeling. There's nothing that can touch you as a man. There's a lot for your brain to chew on, but nothing for your soul to find comfort in. Anyway, as I said, you know, I read him when I was 16, 17, 18. It's pretty funny because that's around the same time that I read Solzhenitsyn, whom I respected but feared, and looked at him a little bit warily. Whereas Joyce I embraced. And here, 30 years later, my positions are completely reversed. I embrace Solzhenitsyn and his humanity. Whereas Joyce, I look at him with contempt. Because not only as an artist who did not give me anything in terms of feeding my soul, he was a horrible man. He was a drunkard who didn't take care of his family. And I know exactly what he was doing. He was writing his novels as a way to escape his life. A lot of artists do that, by the way. A lot of artists will write as a way to escape the lives, the misery of the lives that they're leading. Joyce did it in 2 ways, by way of alcohol and by way of writing. By writing clever. Because you see, he was a man of great ability who never amounted to much. And so he created books that would be admired. He himself said that he wrote his novels so that they would be read for hundreds of years in universities. See? In academia. He didn't care about the normal people reading his books. He wanted academics to be reading his books forever. He wanted immortality by way of academia. And so he wrote these very complex and erudite books that were inhumane. You know? They were clever, sure. They were filled with information, encyclopedic in their vast marshalling of knowledge and facts. allusions and languages. They were brilliant, sure, no question. But they are the work of a loser. The work of a man who never amounted to anything except being a drunk in fancy clothes. See? And let's not even get into the sordidness of his relationship with his daughter. Because there's no pretty way to put it. There was something unwholesome about that relationship. Likely some sort of, why mince words? Likely something incestuous going on there, but nobody will ever know. Everybody there who would know is dead, and they left no written record. But it's all just so sordid and pathetic, because at the end of the day, what happened with James Joyce was that he was a man who was a failure and was unable to straighten up his life and provide, material sustenance to his family. Because his family, he was always broke, and he was always blowing money on, fancy clothes and drinking, right? And so his family suffered needlessly. And the worst part is that he had the talent to be a pulp writer. I mentioned a few weeks ago, about Mario Puzo when he wrote The Godfather. Mario Puzo was a serious novelist, or started out as a serious novelist. But he needed money for his family. So he shelved his ambitions for, literary legitimacy, and wrote the best pulp novel that he could, which was The Godfather, which, ironically enough, I think it's a classic and a book that will last for decades, if not centuries. It's great fun. It's a great book, brilliantly written, brilliantly imagined, right? With incredible insights about what it means to be a man. I said this before, but my point is, Puzo sacrificed his desire for literary acclaim for the sake of feeding his family. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. That's the whole point of having a family, okay? You are deciding that you are going to sacrifice yourself for your own children, And not sacrifice your life, like, put it in some sort of bonfire, and go up in flames, No, I mean in the sense of, working sometimes in things that you don't want to for the sake of your family, of your children. It's more important. But James Joyce didn't do that. In his selfishness and his desire for acclaim, his desire for his ego to be spit-shined and polished by the acclaim of others, he sacrificed the well-being of his family to write Ulysses, to write Finnegan's Wake. He could have written many pulp novels that would have made him a lot of money. I mean, he was such a brilliant writer. Why didn't he do that? Why put his family through so much misery? I mean, that's the question I ask myself now as a 49-year-old man. If he was so brilliant, why didn't he write a moneymaker? Was his ego so large? The answer is yes, of course. He was afraid of being just a writer who earned a living as a writer, and he wanted something, he wanted to be acclaimed, and he was willing to have other people suffer for it. How can you respect such a man? I mean, I can't. When I was 16, 17, 18, when I was reading him and learning about his life, sure, I could think of that because I didn't know any better. I didn't know. But I know better now. And what I thought was heroic when I was 16, 17, 18, now I realize is just despicable, unforgivable, I mean, forgetting about the issue of probably abusing his daughter, certainly messing with her head in a way that is unconscionable, From the few surviving letters about that relationship, because Joyce's grandson destroyed a whole batch of those letters back in 1985. Why do you think that was? Because a lot of those letters must have revealed the details of that relationship, of how sordid and awful it was. And Joyce's grandson didn't want anybody to ever see it. That's why he burned those letters. He conserved a lot of material. He has a whole truckload of stuff. But those letters of that relationship, they were burned. Why? Guess why? Why do you think? Huh? You see, you have to look at a man's life. Joyce was very contradictory, because he was of the opinion that you should not examine an artist's life, that you should only pay attention to the work. But the thing is, that's impossible with James Joyce, because all of his work depended on his biography. The very fact of June 16th, 1904, being the day that he had met Nora Barnacle, and that being the day in Ulysses where everything takes place, right? You had to know about Joyce's life and the significance of that date. And there are a whole bunch of other bits and pieces of biographical information that are stuffed into all of his work, and you have to know that work. He wanted immortality by way of his writing. He didn't want to be the anonymous author that nobody ever knows about, you know, discreetly paring his nails, as he said in that famous phrase. Shakespeare did that. We know practically nothing about Shakespeare, but we have all his works in front of us. But James Joyce was a selfish, rotten man who hid from his responsibilities under the guise of creating art. And he didn't create any art, not any art worthwhile. They're all just baubles. Don't be like him. Don't be like that man. Don't become so egotistical and self-centered that you think that your craft, your art, the things that you do and care about, that they are more important than the other people around you, the people in your life, the people you love and who love you. Because ultimately, that is what a life is. The people whom you love and who love you. Everything else, including great art, everything else is secondary. And Joyce didn't know that. For the sake of his ego, he created a body of work that is remarkable in its vacuity, and created this work at a cost that is incomprehensible insofar as his family. I feel nothing but contempt for the man. He used to be my hero, but now when I think of him with contempt.